All right. Hey, welcome everybody to this week's version of Directional Faith Live, where we're going to talk about this our verse for this week. It's not Romans 12:2. That's from last week. We're going to be talking about John 11:1 through 44. Right, and in this is the story of Lazarus. Everybody's heard the story of Lazarus before, but I'm hoping that I can take it into a direction that maybe you haven't covered it before. So, for instance, I want to not just talk about the fact that obviously Jesus was able to conquer death, but what are the little nuances of this story that we can pick out and take back into our lives? Because obviously, we're going to have Jesus raise us from the dead, bring us to heaven someday, but how does the rest of this story apply to our life? That's the focus here on Directional Faith Live, is to make sure that we look at Scripture and figure out ways to actually use it in your life. So this week we're going to talk about a few different subjects, and we're going to start with. Let me share my screen here with you. Let me go back, and we're going to be talking about these five topics today. So first, we're going to talk about why did Jesus wait to see Lazarus? When Jesus first found out that Lazarus was going to die, he didn't leave right away. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. And along those same lines, why did he, by waiting, he allowed Lazarus to die? What was the purpose of that? We're going to look at Mary and Martha's kind of seemingly lack of faith, where they didn't seem to have that immediate faith to trust in Jesus' will and God's will, obviously. We're going to talk about Jesus' ability to conquer death. And then we're going to wrap all this up by putting it together so we understand God's timing for your life, right? How exactly does this show that, when we're trying to find God's will for our lives, that we need to sometimes stop and pause a moment and wait for God's timing. So like I said, this is a classic story, one that you've probably read many times or heard many times from the pulpit. But I don't think we really dive into some of the specifics of what's going on. We really focus on Lazarus being brought back to life, and obviously the great miracle that is. But we also need to talk about, what were the circumstances that drove the whole scenario. So we're going to take this verse and we're going to break it down section by section. We're not going to read it all at once. We're going to kind of break it down. And I picked out just a few of the verses. We're not going to go through the entire 44 verses. We're going to go through kind of the highlights, and I'll fill in the gaps from there. So when we look back at this verse, it starts off with, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill, so the sisters sent a message to Jesus, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.'" So an important part of that is that now we're starting to realize that we know who Mary and Martha and Lazarus are, right? When we look at this, it gave us right there in the verse, it tells us that she was the one that, put perfume on his feet and was wiping it. So we've learned about her before. She's a recurring character now. We're starting to get to know her more. And the relationship that Jesus was building with his followers. She wasn't just somebody that kind of came and went. And obviously there's other details about her life and well, all three of their lives that we know. But the reason why they're telling you this is so that you understand the importance of who Lazarus was. That this is somebody that Jesus loves, somebody that Jesus cared about. And they came to Jesus and specifically said, "Lord, this man that you love is ill. Are you going to come help him?" What Jesus decided to do next, though, that's where the surprise come in, and there's a little bit of a twist. Because if we really think about it, if Jesus wanted to, he could have healed Lazarus in that moment. Jesus literally could have just snapped his fingers and Lazarus would have been fine. Jesus didn't actually have to go to Lazarus. Jesus didn't have to be in his presence to make this happen. He's got the power of God, the will of God on his side, where he could have literally just prayed, snapped his fingers, and Lazarus would have been fine. So there has to be kind of an intention to what was going on. Jesus didn't do this, just for his sake. There was a purpose that he was trying to show with us and try to teach with us. And so we're going to jump back into that. And let's add that. So in the next verse, But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. What? uh, you know, why did Jesus wait for 2 days? He had the opportunity to go save Lazarus right then. They notified him and said, "Go save him." They were coming to Jesus for help, and Jesus' response was to sit back and say, I'll be there in a couple of days. Why would he do that? Why would he decide not to go right away? Or like I said, why would he not simply snap his fingers right there and save his friend? He took a very intentional approach to this. And I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think are some of the reasons of why Jesus would have let this happen? Why did Jesus wait a couple of days before he left to go save Lazarus? And I want to encourage you that if you're watching live now, make sure you put it in the chat box, or if you're watching the replay, leave it in the comments. Talk to us and share your thoughts and feelings. What are some of the reasons? Because I think there's actually a few things going on here, a few lessons that we can pull from it that we can use, and I'll make sure to pull some of your comments into the live stream here. So immediately, Heather, who's always here hanging out with us at the show, Heather states, "I think God sometimes delays answering our prayers in order to strengthen our faith and trust in him. He has a purpose." And I definitely think that's one of the things. And especially, we're going to talk a little bit more about the disciples and their reaction to some of this. The disciples are really confused as all this stuff is going on. They really didn't understand what's going on. And he did some of these things in order to teach them some of these lessons, in order to strengthen their faith. We'll also see that with Mary and Martha, where they're kind of questioning Jesus, what's going on? I think we're going to see some of that here in a moment. So if we go back. So now he's speaking to the disciples, so that they were in this point where he's trying to explain to them what's going on. He's saying that he's telling them that his friend is asleep, is actually the words that he used. Right? Lazarus is asleep. We're going to go there. And the disciples said, "Well, he's asleep. What's the big deal? There's nothing to worry about." So Jesus, he's getting a little frustrated, I think, at this point. And he turns to them and says, "Then Jesus told them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.'" So he specifically states that he's doing this so that they will believe. That, similar to what Heather was just saying, he's doing this to demonstrate something to them. He didn't just let Lazarus die. And he's not doing it for his own glory. He wants to teach them something. And even in this moment, you see how the disciples, they're not there. They're not getting it. They're not quite following what is going on. And so he's trying to find a way to show them, because more often than not, when you read throughout the Gospels, you see how Jesus is trying to teach something to the disciples. He's even using different analogies and metaphors and all the parables that he speaks in, and they're still not catching on. And in this moment, he spoke very plainly to them. It says that he decided Lazarus is dead. He spoke to them very directly and said, "Lazarus is dead, but I'm doing this so that you will learn." Hopefully there's no more question for the disciples after that, but we're going to see that that's not quite the end of it. So we're going to go back. So why do we think that Jesus let Lazarus die, though? So we just found out that he's trying to teach the disciples a lesson. What do you think that lesson might be? Again, leave it in the chat box, leave it down in the comments. Share some of your thoughts and ideas. What are some of the things, and we're going to dive into a couple of them, what are some of the things that are possibly driving some of this that make us think, here's the reasons of why Jesus would allow this to happen? That I don't think it was, again, it's not something that was unplanned. He had every opportunity to make something happen, but he decided to sit and wait for 2 days instead. So what is the purpose behind all of that? All right. So if we go in the next verse, it says, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So I should cut back. So obviously, at this point, Jesus has traveled there with the disciples. They've met up with Mary and Martha. And this is Martha's response when she first sees Jesus. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And so when we're looking at this verse, Martha's first response where she says, Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died. So in a way, I kind of see that she's questioning Jesus a little bit. She's questioning Jesus and God's will for this whole situation. And Zahara just left a comment, and I think this is really a good point. That was it to show that God is in control? And I think that's exactly it. That Martha had this response, and Mary's response was very similar to Martha's, where they said, Jesus, why did you allow this to happen? If you had just shown up, none of this would have happened. And they immediately questioned him. But this is for Jesus to show that, hey, I've got this. This is all under control. God's will be done. You just need to be patient and allow it to happen. So Zahara, thank you for that. Appreciate it. And as we dive back into the verse again, Jesus straight up told her, your brother will rise again. But Martha's response was, oh, I know that he'll rise again on the resurrection day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. And so we're seeing kind of the enlightenment of Martha here in the moment where initially her response is that, well, yeah, of course I know he's going to be resurrected again on resurrection day. That, at the end of the world, on that one day when everything's come to an end, God's going to raise everybody up again and that whole thing. Jesus is trying to show her, no, I'm the resurrection. I am the life. And he's trying to teach her that resurrection is available for her now, that it's not something that she necessarily has to wait to see, that Jesus is going to make this happen right now, that this is that moment. And you start to see how Martha is putting the pieces together and starting to believe and starting to understand what the real purpose of the Messiah is at this point. Probably in a way that even the disciples are struggling with it, prior to this. She's starting to understand, oh, this is what's going on. In the next verse, okay, so again, I mentioned that Mary and Martha had a very similar reaction. I'm not going to cover Martha's portion of it, but she said almost the exact same thing as Martha. Do you think that Mary and Martha were faithful? Do you think that they were struggling to understand? Or do you think that they lacked faith? What do you think was going on in their minds? To me, I think that there was a part of them that did have faith, right? I mean, Martha's saying, Lord, I believe that you're gonna raise Lazarus on the resurrection day. So she believed in who Jesus was and that he was the Messiah and these type of things, but she was struggling in that moment to find God's will for what was going on. She lacked that moment, that faith in the moment. And how many times do you think that we find ourselves in that same situation? I know I believe in God. I know that he's going to save me one day, take me off to heaven, and well, I hope anyways. hope I've met the criteria, and I have that faith and that hope. But there are still times in my day-to-day life where I struggle to find God's will in it. I struggle to find why he is doing what he is doing. Why is he pushing me in a certain direction? Why is he allowing certain things to happen in my life? I mean, just look at COVID-19, for instance. All of us are sitting back and trying to figure out what is God's will in all of this. And it's really hard to put our finger on sometimes. It's confusing. It's usually not until after the fact that we can look back and start to see some of the change and the growth in our life that led us there. So let's check in the comments and see what some other people had to say about that. So those of you who stopped by the show, everyone knows Mary. uh, so Mary wanted to point out that because everything is in God's time, not ours, which is really the whole gist of this entire story, was that Jesus was showing them what time, what God's timing looks like compared to our timing. Just like how we've talked about in other situations, talked about God's will versus our will, there's also God's timing and our timing. And that even if we were to surrender to God's will, we have to do so completely. And that includes making sure that we're surrendering to his timing on things as well. I was just speaking to someone yesterday in spiritual direction who was struggling with a certain aspect of their lives. And at the time, it seemed like everything just wasn't falling into place. They were struggling every step of the way, that in dealing with this one relationship, they just weren't getting the traction that they wanted. But over the last 4, 5, 6 months, we've been talking, going over things, and she's been letting more and more of it go. It wasn't an easy process for her. It was something that she struggled with. She loves being able to, kind of keep things under her control and direct her life the way she wants. And in this case, to work with her son and help him. Now, she wasn't getting the reaction that she was hoping for, but over time, she's slowly put more and more of it in God's hands. And now that she's sitting back and allowing things to happen in God's timing, that situation's been resolved, and a number of her other relationships are starting to improve because she stopped trying to control her life and try to exert her will on everything, that she put it into God's hands, and she's been able to trust in that. And it's been, honestly, it's been great to work with her and see all these great things happening. And that's what we get from our faith. And that's what we get when we sit back and we trust in God and put everything into his control. So, make sure you continue to leave your comments. Make sure, if you haven't stopped by here before, tell us where you've been from. So I really appreciate this story, and because it ties into a lot of the things that I love to talk and teach about, which obviously for most people know that follow this know that I love talking about God's will. And this is just kind of an offshoot of that. We're talking about following God's will, but also following God's timing. So if you're just jumping in, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can get notified when I actually am going live. And let's jump back into the verses again. In the next verse, Jesus is there and they're standing in front of the tomb, right? And this is the moment where everything happens. And this is the moment where Jesus is going to show them what God can really do for their lives. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was laying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God?" And again, we're seeing this struggle that her brother is dead. She's upset, understandably. That any one of us put in that situation where we lose a loved one or we're facing some sort of crisis in our life, of course, we tell ourselves that, we're going to have faith and we're going to 100% believe in God at that moment. But we're going to have questions and we're going to have doubts and we're going to have fears. She lost somebody that she loves very much. And if you face something like that recently, whether it's, a loss of a loved one through death or in a relationship, or you're struggling financially or going through any of these other hardships, you may be in a situation where you're trying to figure out, where's God's hand in all this? And none of this makes sense. And she questioned him from a logical standpoint, because that's where we're at. She's basically telling Jesus, hey, it's going to stink in there, right? The guy's been dead for 4 days and you want to open up this tomb. I don't think that's a good idea. And Jesus' response to her was, hey, did I not just tell you what I'm going to do? And, we thought that she was starting to believe a little bit, but here she goes again, struggling with that faith, struggling with that belief of what Jesus could really make happen in that moment. So it was a kind of another opportunity for Jesus to show her, hey, I know that this doesn't make logical sense, but if you trust in me, it will make sense. And that's the same thing that in our lives, it's not always going to make logical sense to us. When we're looking at COVID-19, it doesn't make logical sense. Why would God allow these things to happen? And it's really hard for us to put into words or to figure out. We could spend the rest of our times meditating, just trying to figure out why these crises happen in our life. But when we look back on them, we can see some of the good that has come from it. We can see the heroic frontline workers and the great things that they've done for us. We have started to appreciate our medical people so much more than we did before. And for me personally, COVID-19 has been a great time of spiritual growth, an opportunity for me to start evangelizing more and start this channel. So there are ways that we can find positive things even in the darkest moments. So when we're looking to the next verse, let me pull that up. So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. Okay, so we're looking at this, and Jesus is clearly stating, I'm putting on a show. Let's face it. He's being very honest with the crowd for them to hear. He could have just obviously communicated directly with the Father and said, Lord, make this happen, or Father, make this happen. He said this out loud so that they understood what was happening. They understood that he was invoking God's will, and what was about to happen was because of that. That he wanted to make it clearly known that this was God's will. That it wasn't just him acting on his own behalf. That, especially when you think back that when you talk about the Pharisees and all this, there's always a lot of questions about whose name are they calling upon? Are they calling upon God's name? Are they calling on their own name? Are they calling on the name of a prophet? Are they calling on the name of, Beelzebub? And so that was always the big question was, oh, well, it's not right for them to be going around and, causing these healings to happen and doing these things because, whose name are they calling upon? Jesus outwardly calls on God's name in that moment so that everybody knows exactly who he's talking to. He's not calling on his own name. He's not calling on some demon. He's literally calling on the name of God and saying, please resurrect this man. So hop to the next verse. Again, we're going to dive back into that. Why do you think that Jesus let him die? So we've got to this point to where Jesus has waited a couple days so that Lazarus would die. And we found that Jesus is trying to teach a few lessons. For one, he's calling on the name of God. He literally just in this last moment said, hey, for the crowd to hear and know that I am calling on God's name, this is why I'm doing it, right? So that they're able to hear it. Now, I don't think those are the only reasons, but I think that's where we're beginning, is that Jesus is trying to show them that, hey, I am using God's name in all of this, and that everything that I'm doing is in tandem with the Father, that he's not working on his own, he's not doing his own thing, that he does have that direct special connection to the Father. And he wanted them to be able to do the same thing. He's doing this as an example. It's not just something for them to recognize, oh, this is what Jesus can do. He wants them to realize that this is what they can do. That if they were able to do the same thing, to trust in God, to call on God's name, that when they're in a crisis and when you're facing a struggle or a difficult time, When you've lost a loved one, not to say that God's going to raise them from the dead as well, but when you've lost a loved one and you need the strength to endure and to cope, when you're facing financial hardship, not that God is going to necessarily deliver you directly out of that financial hardship, but for Him to help provide for you, help you find ways to cope and to find the resources you need to continue on, that we can take these prayers to Him, and that there's literally nothing that He can't do. That if Jesus can conquer death, then what else? What comes up in our life that He could not do? The point was that you have to take it to God in the first place. Jesus did. It wasn't that He could just magically make this happen. It was the fact that He called on God's name. And He's trying to teach us that if we want to have God's will kind of brought into our life, it starts with prayer. It starts with us turning to God and asking for that. So I want to, there are a lot of people that have stopped by and said amen to that. If you like this video so far, make sure you leave an amen in the comments. But I also want to make sure that if you want to be able to catch these live, if you join a couple minutes late, if you hit the subscribe button and then you hit the little bell icon next to it, it'll notify you when we're going live next. And also, my plan is every Friday at 3 Eastern, 2 Central to go live with this. So make sure to set it in your calendar, whatever it takes for you, to make sure that you remember that we're going to go live with a new video. And we'll continue to do these Bible studies each week. All right, so back to the Bible verse. When He had said this, He cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Such a powerful part of the verse, and such a powerful part of what we're seeing today, is the fact that here's Jesus finally conquering death. But I think this is just the beginning. There was a part where earlier on we had talked about the fact that the disciples needed to see and the disciples needed to learn something. And what I think we're taking from this verse right now is that the disciples needed to know that Jesus could conquer death, because what was going to be the first thing that happened when He died? They were going to doubt. We're entering this Lenten season right now, and there's a part of us that, for us, it's easy. We can look back at the history of what happened. We can read scripture and we know what happened. And so as Jesus is on His way to the cross, we know the final result, and it's easy for us to understand why it happened. But for the disciples, for the apostles, they didn't understand. Jesus is starting to tell them, "I'm about to die. This is the end. What is going on?" And they've got nothing but questions. And He wanted them to understand when His death came, that they would be ready for it, that they would know that He could conquer death. Now, we'll get to this in a few weeks, but we know they still struggle with that idea. They were really shocked and confused when everything was going down, when the entire passion and the entire crucifixion happened. They didn't understand why this had to happen still. But Jesus was planting this seed in their mind, knowing that they were going to need it in a few short weeks, that they needed to know that He could conquer death. That by calling on God's name, calling on the Father's name specifically, that He'd be able to do that. So as we jump back into this last page here. So why do you think Jesus raised Lazarus? I just gave my opinion on it, which was thinking that there was this conquering of death that He wanted to show the disciples and the apostles that He could do. Down in the comments, tell me some of the reasons why you think that Jesus raised Lazarus. So there's a friend here, and I can't understand, can't read his name, unfortunately. I don't read it, but obviously a Muslim friend of ours, and I just want to welcome you. I think it's great that you actually stopped by. He said that Muslims believe that Jesus raised the dead too. And there are commonalities in our faith. And, we have our differences, and we focus so much on our differences sometimes. even amongst Christians, we focus so much on our different denominations and stuff. And I really love that here in the comments that everybody can share together and everybody can be loving and compassionate and kind to one another. So I ask that you continue to do that. Thank you for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. So Heidi Green stopped by and she said, simply, Jesus has power over death, right? That's why, and I think this is what it comes down to. We talked about Jesus proving to the world that he had the ability to do this, that for many different reasons. It was to show the disciples, it was to show his followers, and eventually one day to show us that we would fully understand what God can really do, that there were really no limits to what he could do. So thank you, Heidi, and thank you for stopping by. Let me pull that back up. So Jesus proved that he could overcome death, right? So Heidi led me right into a couple of my final points here. Jesus proved that he could overcome death. The disciples would need this after Jesus' death on the cross. They needed to know that he could conquer death in order to have hope in the resurrection. But how does this apply to God's will and God's timing in your life? Everyone start leaving in the comments in the chat box some ideas of how you think this applies to situations that you face, things that you're facing right now. But I can tell you that just in general, that when we look at God's will for our lives, God's timing is completely entwined with it, because part of that will is the timing. We may be asking God for certain things to happen in our life, and usually we're asking for those things right now. He may want to grant us whatever it is we're praying for. Maybe we're praying for that better career, or for that opportunity to come along that we've been waiting so long for. Or maybe we're waiting for a new relationship to start, and we want it right now. And when we don't get it right now, we start to get frustrated. We start to lose faith, like Mary and Martha. We start to struggle like the disciples to even understand what is going on. But if we stop and say, maybe God is answering that prayer. Maybe Jesus is allowing this to happen in our lives because there's a greater truth that is about to happen. We just don't understand it yet. Think of this one act of Jesus waiting 2 days. That was the one thing that Jesus did. He said, just wait a couple of days. Give it some time. Things still didn't go the way they had planned. It definitely went down a darker path, and I'm sure Mary and Martha had wanted. But the end result was far greater than what they could have hoped for. And now not only did they have their brother back, but think of the impact that this story has had over the last 2,000 years. That Mary and Martha, I think this story, I mean, there's other stories of Mary and Martha in the New Testament, or in the Gospel specifically. But this story alone is one of the ones that really makes us recognize who Mary and Martha are because of their relation to Lazarus and to Jesus, of course. So this one story has had a lasting impact and really defined what our faith is for 2,000 years, that Jesus has the ability to conquer death and to do anything in our lives if we're willing to wait, if we're willing to put it in God's hands to wait on his timing. So I want to thank everybody for stopping by. A lot of the usual characters. I'm hoping that each week we're going to continue to grow this and have more people stopping by. I love love all the support. If you're watching on the replay, I ask that you leave some comments too. Make sure that you share your thoughts and ideas. I want to, this is a Bible study. It's not just me sitting up here, quote unquote, preaching from a pulpit. I really meant this as a way for us to look at the Bible together, to dive into little passages of it, and to have a conversation back and forth. There's been some great conversation in the chat box, and I'm hoping that continues in the comments afterwards. So again, if you want to catch the next one, hit that subscribe button. Make sure to hit the bell icon so you get the notifications of when I'm going live next. I'll try to keep posting other videos in the meantime, but otherwise, I'll see you next Friday at 3 Eastern, 2 Central. Thank you, and God bless. Bye-bye.